Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. We chatted in recent episodes this gone by week about time in a few episodes. I mentioned that I'm in the process of doing a little bit of home office renovation and paring down because we're preparing for a move, and some of that is actually replacing kind of old gear and putting up a couple of little touches before we have to go into the moving boxes again. And one of the things I mentioned I always wanted was a nice wall clock with the time in local and UTC, as any self-respecting aviation or military or geopolitics nerd must know the time in Zulu. So we talked actually about the rather complex world of timekeeping for control rooms and the type of places where this gear is kind of quintessentially up. And it's a pretty interesting world of really high. I had no idea that it was this complicated to have, they have an NTP master server, physical hardware, local clocks. So it makes sense why these, the actual clocks that they use are extremely expensive. But one can suffice with some more basic gear from AliExpress if you don't need to have your wall clocks in perfect synchrony to whatever the smallest degree of time is. But we should talk as well about the whole concept of time zones and daylight saving time, because I was telling my wife about Zulu time or UTC this week and how incredibly useful it is that you can have this standard of time against which, if you know local time or you know your UTC offset and the UTC offset in another time zone, you can kind of know exactly what time it is in any place in the world. And then my wife asked me the question I was hoping she wouldn't ask me, because I would lose my feeling that I was an all-knowing oracle like Herman Poppleberry. She said, wait, so is UTC the same as GMT? And I had to think for a second, and I thought, wait, no, isn't GMT the time zone? My understanding of UTC was always that it was actually detached from time zones, because Greenwich Mean Time is a time zone and it changes because of daylight saving time. So if I'm not mistaken, and Herman and Corin, this is the point I'd love to clarify in this episode, UTC is always daylight savings agnostic. And when you have time zones that are on daylight saving time or they're not, that changes their offset against UTC. In any event, that's question one. Question two is this whole concept of daylight savings. Does every country operate it? Because when you start looking at the concept of how time is implemented in computer systems and NTP, I wrote an article once about a guy who maintains a database called the TZDB. And it was just one of those things long before I started this podcast that provided a great launching off point into another really weird and obscure world. So the TZDB is integrated into pretty much every Linux computer out there. But the kind of semi-comical thing about it is that this definition of time zones, that's literally, if you have a Linux computer in your house or a server in your business, the guys managing this, it's a remarkably small group of people, and they have to spend their time, often as volunteers, laboring over these very arcane questions of time zones. Like sometimes it's political, countries and as a political move change into another time zone. You've kind of weird edge cases where the same places in the same geographical territory, let's say Israel and the Palestinian territories, will not go over to daylight saving on the same time. So you can literally have two places next to one another. So it's not a simple topic at all. And my question, Herman and Corin, is that for the sake of simplification in the world order and timekeeping. Do we need this? And when was the whole idea of time zones and daylight saving actually kind of introduced? Because the elegance of Zulu is nice, but it's complicated a bit by the fact that the offsets change a lot, and the dates at which different countries move on and off daylight saving is also an inconsistent mess that sometimes even changes from year to year. Not typically, but if you read up on the TZDB and their mail serve, you'll see that it's actually not a simple task even maintaining this database. It's not like a wiki that never changes. It has to be constantly curated. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to chat today about the complications or the nuances in international timekeeping, and really how it all works. Herman and Corin, over to you.
You know, Herman, I was looking at that old grandfather clock in the hallway this morning, the one that's been out of sync since we moved in, and it really hit me how much we take the concept of now for granted. We look at our phones, we look at our computers, and we just assume the time displayed is some objective, universal truth. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that time, at least the way we measure it, is a total social construct.
It is a beautiful and highly engineered illusion, isn't it? Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, if you pull back the curtain on how we actually define now, it's less of a solid foundation and more of a series of compromises, committee meetings, and very, very precise vibrations of atoms. We like to think of time as this flowing river, but in the world of metrology and computer science, it's more like a giant global spreadsheet that everyone is constantly arguing over.
Exactly. And it's funny you mention the curtain, because Daniel's prompt today is all about pulling that curtain back. He's asking about the difference between Universal Coordinated Time and Greenwich Mean Time, whether every country actually uses daylight savings, and how on earth computer systems manage to keep track of all these shifting rules. It's one of those things that feels like it should be simple, but the moment you try to program a calendar app, you realize you've entered a nightmare dimension.
It's a fantastic topic because it's the ultimate edge case. For most people, time is just what's on the microwave. For developers, it's a source of endless bugs. And for historians and geographers, it's a fascinating map of colonial power, national identity, and economic pragmatism. It's a rare subject that touches on quantum physics and international diplomacy in the same breath.
Well, let's start with the basics, because I think this is where most of the confusion lies for people like Daniel. He asked if Universal Coordinated Time, or UTC, is the same as Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT. My understanding was that GMT is a time zone, while UTC is more of a technical standard. Is that right, or am I oversimplifying?
You're spot on, Corn. That is the fundamental distinction, but the history of how we got there is fascinating. Greenwich Mean Time was originally a solar time standard. It was established in 1884 at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. They decided that the prime meridian 0 degrees longitude would pass through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London. GMT was based on the average time that the sun crosses that meridian. For a long time, it was the world's primary time standard because the British Navy was the dominant force on the seas, and they needed a consistent reference for navigation.
So, GMT was literally tied to the sky. It was sun time.
Exactly, but GMT has a bit of a dual identity today. In the United Kingdom and some other countries, it is indeed a time zone that people live by during the winter months. When the clocks go back, London is on GMT, but GMT itself is technically an astronomical measurement, and as our technology improved, we realized the stars weren't reliable enough.
Right. And then they switched to British summertime in the summer. So GMT itself doesn't change in the summer, but the people using it as their local time move away from it.
Precisely. Now, UTC is different. Universal Coordinated Time is the primary time standard by which the world regulates clocks and time today. It is not a time zone. No one officially lives in UTC. Instead, every time zone in the world is defined by its offset from UTC. For example, if you are in New York during the winter, you are in UTC -5. If you are in Jerusalem with us, we are currently in UTC +2.
So why did we need UTC if we already had GMT? Was GMT not precise enough for the 20th century?
It wasn't just about precision, it was about what we were measuring. GMT is based on the Earth's rotation. The problem is that the Earth is a bit of a wobbler. Its rotation isn't perfectly consistent. It's slowing down very slightly over long periods due to tidal friction from the moon, and it can even speed up or slow down due to internal geological shifts, like massive earthquakes or changes in the Earth's core.
So, if we rely on the Earth's rotation to define a second, our seconds wouldn't all be the same length. They'd be stretching and shrinking based on how the planet is feeling that day.
Exactly. And in the age of telecommunications, GPS, and high-frequency trading, we need seconds that are exactly the same length every single time. That's where atomic clocks come in. UTC is calculated using International Atomic Time, or TAA. TAI is a weighted average of over 400 atomic clocks around the world. These clocks measure the vibrations of cesium-133 atoms. Specifically, a second is defined as 9,192,631,770 vibrations of that atom.
That is an incredibly specific number. But wait, if UTC is based on these perfect atomic clocks, but the Earth is still wobbling and slowing down, wouldn't the atomic time eventually get out of sync with the actual position of the sun?
That is exactly the problem. If we just let the atomic clocks run, eventually noon would happen when the sun was setting. To fix this, we have what is called UT1, which is the time based on the Earth's actual rotation. UTC is a compromise between the two. It follows the perfect tick of atomic time, but we add or subtract leap seconds to keep it within 0.9 seconds of UT1.
Leap seconds. Those are the things that occasionally break the internet, right? I remember hearing about servers crashing because they didn't know how to handle that extra tick.
Oh, they are a nightmare for computer systems. Most software is written with the assumption that every minute has 60 seconds. When you suddenly have a minute with 61 seconds, things start to crash. In fact, there's a big move right now to phase out leap seconds entirely. In November of 2022, the General Conference on Weights and Measures voted to eliminate leap seconds by the year 2035. They decided that the headache of keeping atomic time in sync with the Earth's rotation wasn't worth the technical risk anymore.
That's a huge shift. So by 2035, we'll just let the sun and the clock drift apart?
Very slowly, yes. It would take centuries for it to be noticeable to a regular person, but for computers, it's a massive relief. Some companies, like Google and Amazon, already use something called leap smearing. Instead of adding one extra second at the end of the day, they slightly slow down all the seconds across a 24-hour period, so the system never sees a 61-second minute.
That's clever. It's like a slow motion correction. So, to answer Daniel's first point, UTC is the fixed standard that never changes for daylight savings, while GMT is often used as a synonym for UTC in casual conversation, but technically refers to a time zone that some countries use as their baseline.
Right. If you're a developer or a pilot, you use UTC. If you're a tourist in London in December, you're on GMT. And fun fact, the abbreviation UTC is itself a compromise. English speakers wanted CUT for Coordinated Universal Time, and French speakers wanted TUC for Temps Universal Coordinate. They couldn't agree, so they settled on UTC, which fits neither language perfectly but satisfies both.
That is the most international committee thing I've ever heard. Now, let's talk about the other part of Daniel's question, daylight savings time. He asked if every country operates it. I know from our own experience here that the start and end dates can feel almost random sometimes.
It is far from universal. In fact, as of today in early 2026, only about 70 countries worldwide use daylight savings time in some form. That's less than 40% of the world's nations. If you look at a map, it's mostly a phenomenon of the middle latitudes, North America, Europe, parts of South America, and parts of Australia. Countries near the equator generally don't use it because their day length doesn't change much throughout the year. There's no point in shifting the clocks if the sun always rises and sets at roughly the same time.
And then you have countries like China or India that just don't do it at all, despite their size. China is particularly wild because of how many time zones it should have.
China is a fascinating case of political time. They used to have 5 different time zones, but after the revolution in 1949, the government decided the whole country should run on Beijing time, UTC+8, to promote national unity. So if you're in the far west of China, in Xinjiang, the sun might not rise until 10 in the morning in the winter. They don't use daylight savings because their entire time system is already a massive geographical stretch.
It's interesting how political time is. We think of it as a law of nature, but it's really a law of the state. I remember reading that daylight savings was first proposed as a way to save candles or coal.
That's the classic story. Benjamin Franklin joked about it in an essay in 1784, suggesting Parisians could save on candles by getting out of bed earlier. But the first serious proponents were George Hudson, an entomologist in New Zealand who wanted more daylight hours to collect insects, and William Willett in the United Kingdom, who was an avid golfer and wanted more light in the evening. It wasn't actually adopted until World War I, when Germany and its allies started using it in 1916 to conserve fuel for the war effort. The rest of Europe and the United States followed suit shortly after.
And yet, here we are over 100 years later, and we're still arguing about whether it actually saves energy. Most recent studies suggest the energy savings are negligible, or even offset by increased air conditioning use in the evenings.
It's become more of a cultural and economic preference than a practical one. Retailers love it because people are more likely to go shopping if it's light out when they finish work. Parents often hate it because it messes with children's sleep schedules. And for those of us in the tech world, it's a constant source of bugs. There's a huge movement to end it. In the US, the Sunshine Protection Act has been bouncing around Congress for years. It aims to make daylight savings time permanent, but it keeps getting stalled because people can't agree on whether to stay on permanent summertime or permanent wintertime.
That seems to be the sticking point everywhere. If you go to permanent summertime, the sun rises very late in the winter, which people don't like for kids walking to school in the dark. But if you go to permanent wintertime, you lose those long summer evenings that people love. It's a classic no-win scenario.
Exactly. Russia tried permanent summertime in 2011, but it was so unpopular because of the dark winter mornings that they switched to permanent wintertime in 2014. It's a biological struggle. We can define UTC to the nanosecond, but we can't change the fact that humans generally like to wake up when it's light out.
Which brings us to the third part of Daniel's prompt, the implementation in computer systems and the time zone database. Daniel mentioned that it's a remarkably complex task to maintain. I've heard of the TZDB, but I don't think most people realize that their phone's ability to change time automatically depends on a small group of volunteers.
It is one of the most vital, yet invisible, pieces of infrastructure on the internet. The time zone database, also known as the Olson database after its founder Arthur David Olson, is a collaborative effort to compile information about all the world's time zones. It doesn't just record what time it is now, it records the entire history of time zone changes for every location on Earth going back to the Unix epoch in 1970.
Why would you need the history? If I want to know the time now, why do I care what the rules were in 1982?
Think about a database that stores appointments or historical logs. If I scheduled a meeting in 1995 for a specific time in a specific city, and that city changed its time zone rules in 2005, the computer needs to know the rules that were in place in 1995 to correctly calculate what time that was in UTC. Without that historical context, our records of the past would be shifted and distorted. If you look at a timestamp from 20 years ago, you need to know if daylight savings was active on that specific day in that specific jurisdiction.
That sounds like a massive amount of data to keep track of. Who actually does the work? Is it a government agency?
No, and that's the wild part. For decades, it was primarily Arthur David Olson and a man named Paul Eggert. They, along with a community of contributors on a mailing list, monitor news from all over the world. When a government announces that they are moving their daylight savings start date by a week, or that they are creating a new time zone entirely, these volunteers have to update the database. It's now managed by IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, but it still relies heavily on that community of experts.
And these changes happen more often than people think, right? It's not just once every few decades.
Oh, it happens all the time, often with incredibly short notice. There was a famous incident in March of 2023 in Lebanon. The government announced, just 2 days before it was supposed to happen, that they were delaying the start of daylight savings by a month. This created total chaos. Some institutions, like the Maronite Church, refused to follow the delay. For a few days, the country literally had two different time zones running simultaneously. Airlines had to scramble to update their schedules, and phone carriers were caught in the middle.
I remember that. You could walk across the street in Beirut and move forward or backward an hour depending on which building you entered. For the TZDB, this means they have to create separate entries like Asia/Beirut, and they have to document these weird last-minute political shifts.
Exactly. And then you have the case of Samoa. In 2011, Samoa decided to move from the east side of the international dateline to the west side. They did this to be on the same day as their main trading partners, Australia and New Zealand. To do that, they simply skipped a day. They went from the end of December 29th straight to the beginning of December 31st. December 30th, 2011 never happened in Samoa.
Imagine having your birthday on that day. You just don't get one that year.
You'd be a year older without ever having the day. If you're a programmer and you don't use the TZDB, your code might try to do math on December 30th in Samoa and return an error because that date doesn't exist in the local calendar. This is why the golden rule of programming is never ever try to write your own time zone logic. Always use a library that pulls from the Olsen database.
It makes you realize that now is something that can be debated in a parliament. It makes me wonder about the technical side of how our devices actually get this information. We talk about NTP, the Network Time Protocol. How does that fit in?
NTP is the mechanism for synchronization. If the TZDB is the map, NTP is the heartbeat. NTP allows computers to sync their internal clocks with highly accurate time sources over a network. It was developed by David L. Mills at the University of Delaware in 1985. It uses a hierarchy of strata. Stratum 0 devices are the actual atomic clocks or GPS satellites. Stratum 1 servers are computers directly connected to those devices. Your laptop is probably a Stratum 3 or 4 device, syncing with a server that synced with another server that eventually got its time from an atomic clock.
And NTP is incredibly clever about accounting for network latency, right? It doesn't just ask what time it is, it calculates how long the message took to travel back and forth.
Exactly. It sends a packet, notes the time it was sent, the time it was received by the server, the time the server sent the response, and the time the response arrived back at the client. By doing that math, it can figure out the round-trip delay and adjust the local clock to within a few milliseconds of the source. It's an incredibly robust protocol that has kept the internet running for 40 years.
So we have atomic clocks providing the heartbeat, NTP distributing that heartbeat, and the TZDB providing the local rules for how to interpret that heartbeat. It's a very robust system, but it feels fragile because of the human element in the TZDB.
It is fragile. In fact, back in 2011, the database was actually involved in a lawsuit. A company called Astrolabe claimed that the database's use of certain historical astrology data violated their copyright. The database was briefly taken offline, and the entire tech community panicked. That's when ANA, stepped in to provide a more formal home for it. It showed just how much we rely on this volunteer project. If the TZDB disappears, the world's calendars effectively break.
You mentioned earlier that there are bugs associated with this. What's the most famous time-related bug? Is it still Y2K, or is there something else looming?
Y2K was the big one that everyone knows, but for developers, the real looming threat is the year 2038 problem, or Y2K38.
Oh right, the 32-bit integer limit. Explain that for those who aren't familiar with how computers store time.
Most Unix-based systems, which includes almost all servers, Linux distributions, and Android phones, measure time as the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st, 1970. This is called Unix time or epoch time. Many older systems store this number as a 32-bit signed integer. The maximum value for a 32-bit signed integer is 2,147,483,647.
And when do we hit that number of seconds since 1970?
On January 19, 2038, at exactly 3:14 and 8 seconds UTC. At that moment, the counter will wrap around to a negative number, and these systems will suddenly think it is December 13, 1901.
That sounds like it could be even worse than Y2K because so much more of our infrastructure, like power grids and medical devices, is automated now.
It could be, but the good news is that we've known about it for a long time. Most modern systems have already switched to 64-bit integers for time. A 64-bit integer won't overflow for 292 billion years, which is much longer than the expected life of the universe. But there are still plenty of embedded systems out there. Think about things like industrial controllers, older cars, or deep-sea sensors that might still be using 32-bit time. Those are the ones we'll be worried about in 12 years.
It's a good reminder that time in computing isn't just a number, it's a data type with very real physical limits. I want to go back to the weirdness of time zones for a second. In your research, did you come across any truly bizarre ones? I know there are some that aren't even on the hour or half hour.
Oh, there are some great ones. Nepal is famously on UTC plus 545. They chose that specifically to be slightly different from India, which is on UTC plus 530. It's a very precise way of asserting national identity. Then you have the Line Islands in Kiribati. They are in the same longitude as Hawaii, but they are a full day ahead. They are in UTC plus 14. This was a deliberate move in the late 90s so that they could be among the first nations to see the dawn of the new millennium. Before that, the international date line literally cut right through the middle of the country, which made doing business between the islands nearly impossible.
So they just moved the dateline around themselves?
They did. They drew a big U shape in the dateline to wrap around their easternmost islands. It's another perfect example of how the dateline isn't a straight line dictated by geography, it's a jagged boundary dictated by convenience and politics. And then there's the Australian Central Western Time Zone, which is a tiny strip along the highway in Western Australia that uses UTC plus 845. It's not officially recognized by the government, but everyone in that area uses it, and it's even in the TZDB because it's a de facto reality.
It makes you realize that the world is a lot messier than the neat little maps we see in school. If you're a programmer trying to write a calendar app, how do you even begin to handle all of this? You can't just add 60 minutes to a timestamp and assume it's the same time local to the user.
You absolutely cannot. If you add 60 minutes to a timestamp on the night the clocks go back, you might end up at the exact same local time you started at. Or if you add 24 hours to a timestamp in Samoa in 2011, you might land on a day that didn't exist. The golden rule is always store your time in UTC and only convert to local time at the very last second when you're displaying it to the user. And always use the TZDB to do that conversion.
Because if you try to hard code it, you'll miss the fact that a country decided to change its rules while your app was running.
Exactly. Every entry in the TZDB represents a war, a revolution, a trade agreement, or a frustrated golfer. It really is a history of the modern world told through the lens of the clock, and it's a history that is still being written. Just recently, Mexico decided to abolish daylight savings time for most of the country, but they kept it for some cities near the US border to stay in sync with their neighbors. Every one of those decisions ripples through the global network of computers.
So, thinking about Daniel's prompt and his move, he's looking for a clock that shows both local and UTC. That's actually a very common setup in places like flight control towers or data centers. Why is it so important for those professionals to always have UTC in their line of sight?
Because UTC is the only true time when you're dealing with global operations. If you're a pilot flying from New York to London, your local time is changing constantly. If you try to coordinate with air traffic control using local time, there's a massive risk of confusion. But if everyone is talking in UTC, often called Zulu time in aviation, there is zero ambiguity. 0 hours. Zulu is the same moment for everyone, regardless of where they are on the planet.
It's the universal language of when.
Exactly. And in a world that is increasingly interconnected, we're all becoming a bit like those pilots. We're coordinating meetings across 4 continents, we're watching live events happening on the other side of the world. In a way, we're all living in 2 time zones at once, the one where our bodies are, and the UTC time zone where our digital lives happen.
That's a really profound way to put it. We have our physical now and our digital now. I think that's why Daniel's request for a UTC clock makes so much sense. It's a way of acknowledging that we are part of a global system.
It's a very Herman Poppleberry thing to have on your wall, I have to say. I might have to get one myself. It's a reminder that beneath the chaos of human politics and daylight savings, there is a steady atomic heartbeat that keeps the whole world in sync.
You'd spend all day staring at it, making sure it's in sync with the stratum zero source.
You know me too well. But honestly, even for someone who isn't a nerd like me, understanding this stuff is incredibly practical. It helps you understand why your phone might act up when you travel, or why a meeting invite looks weird, or why springing forward feels so much worse than falling back. It's all about the friction between our biological needs and our technological standards.
Well, let's wrap this up with some practical takeaways for Daniel and everyone else. First, UTC is the standard, GMT is a time zone. If you want to be precise, use UTC.
Second, daylight savings is a mess. It's not universal, the dates change constantly, and it's driven more by politics and economics than by science. If you're traveling or scheduling internationally, always double-check the current local offset using a reliable tool.
Third, for the developers out there, never trust your own math. Use the libraries, use the TZDB, and always store your timestamps in UTC.
And finally, appreciate the volunteers who keep the time zone database running. They are the unsung heroes who make sure your alarm goes off at the right time and your GPS knows where you are. Without Paul Eggert and the rest of that mailing list, the modern world would literally lose track of time.
It's a remarkable system built on a mix of high-tech physics and old-fashioned human cooperation. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from the vibrations of cesium atoms to the golfers of 20th century England and the political borders of the Middle East.
It's been a blast. Time really does fly when you're talking about, well, time.
I knew you were going to say that. I could see it coming from a mile away. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that if you're enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts Daniel sends our way, we'd really appreciate a quick review on your podcast app or a rating on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join our little community here.
It really does make a difference. We love seeing the show grow and hearing your thoughts on these topics.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones where we've touched on time before, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, plus a contact form if you want to reach out. You can also email us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And of course, you can subscribe to our RSS feed on the website or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio fix.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with another prompt that pulls back the curtain on the things we take for granted.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.